He kōna ipurangi tēnei nā te reo irirangi o Aotearoa.
Every game had protests in the town where the Springboks were playing. It was something that New Zealand had really never struck before at that level.
Hi, I'm Jesse Mulligan, and this is Sports History NZ. In this episode, we tackle a big one, the 1981 Springbok Rugby Tour, as remembered by the man who talked us through it. Despite international condemnation, New Zealand had continued to play rugby against South Africa through the years of apartheid. Unbelievably, we even toured there with a whites-only team. Then, in 1981, the Springbok team came here. Keith Quinn was a TVNZ rugby commentator for the tour and had to put aside his own anti-tour views to do his job. I asked him about our attitudes towards apartheid South Africa in 1981 and the feeling here about the tour.
Well, if you go back a few years before that, in the 1970s, I went on the 1976 tour to South Africa, and some of the news media colleagues who went, and a very big contingent of New Zealand news media, they were pro-tour, very pro-tour, and kind of couldn't see the apartheid that was happening in front of them, in their hotels, in the workers, and the fact that everybody was of colour was going home to their homes by something like 8 p.m. at night to live in their own separate suburb. And I saw this, and there was one special game against coloured people. And I thought, this is wrong, because I was playing for a football club back here in Wellington, and I couldn't have played with my mates who were Maori and Pacifica back here in New Zealand at the time. And I thought, I don't like this at all. It's wrong. And so when the Springbok tour of New Zealand was mooted in 1981, the division in New Zealand was incredible. Some people still thought that we should be playing against the Springboks, the mighty Springboks, pushing in the scrums. It doesn't matter if they're all white players, or we should not be. And so attitudes were changing around about 1981, but still I felt that they shouldn't, the Springboks shouldn't come. They weren't quite back at full normal time, and in fact they weren't until Nelson Mandela really came out 11 years after that.
So you had a decision to make, is that right?
Yeah, TVNZ were, I thought, when I think back now, were very good. They realised that the debate was going on around the country in every household as to whether people were pro or anti the tour. And so they said to their staff, because they could hear the debates going on amongst their staff, if you don't want to work on the Springbok tour, you don't have to. You can be assigned to other duties, other sports, other news, other editing, sound work, camera work, etc., etc. So I decided to go on the commentary. I had a commentary profile, and so I continued that. But I said to the bosses, I don't want to do anything else but commentate on the games. I don't want to meet any Springboks. I don't want to interview any Springboks. I don't want to do backgrounders or newscasts. And that sounds a bit big-headed today, I'm afraid. But they allowed that to happen because they were very good with their staff over that particular situation.
Do you feel did you feel like you made the right decision looking back at it over the years?
I think so from my perspective, I guess. But because I went to all the games, I saw the games, I can give you opinions on the games and the background to the tour now. And at the time, there were two decisions for me to make, and I made the one, which meant I just did the games. I didn't do anything else. It was quite a difficult time for everybody in television and in the media, because we had people were spitting at us too, pro or against. If TVNZ announced the Springbok team for the first test, or the All Black team for the first test, protesters were saying you're obviously pro-tour. And if we showed the protest marching up Queen Street or down Colombo Street in Christchurch, then we were obviously on the other side of the debate. So we got it from all directions. And it was a very difficult time to come through. So I had my decision to make and made it.
Were you at that first match against Poverty Bay in Gisborne?
Yeah, see, right from the very start, Jesse, there was something happened at every game. At the first game in Gisborne, there was glass thrown out of a small truck the night before the game on a Friday night at dusk. I was there with a news guy. We were just taking our cameras back to the city. We'd filmed the empty ground, and his line was going to be, and so tomorrow on this empty field, the tour will start. And then this car came roaring through and threw glass all over the field. By the time the game kicked off the next day, the glass had been carefully picked up by rugby officials, but I could see from the top of the grandstand the whole protest coming down the golf course behind the ground. So that was game one. Game two was the one at Hamilton where the protest was so they pulled the fence down and charged the field, and so the game had to be abandoned even before kickoff.
I've got a little clip from Poverty Bay just to take people back. We've got Mariana Pittman describing the scene here. Here it is.
We'd get to the top of the fence and they would beat us and kick us and throw us down the bank, and we'd get up and we'd go up again. And it didn't work that time. But the following weekend in Hamilton it did, because we were much better planned.
Yeah, that's the recollections of a lot of people getting in touch on text, Keith, that it actually, although the protesters went to disrupt the games, it was often the protesters who were being protected by the police from the supporters who showed up, who really outnumbered them.
I remember Wilson Winneray, who was a former All Black captain, saying he admired the police so much at the end of the tour because they were always going to be the meat in the sandwich. That was his quote, meat in the sandwich, because they were getting it too from both sides. There was another game that was abandoned. That was in Timaru, just abandoned a couple of days before the game. But there were protests at various stages building through the tour. At Manawatu and Taranaki, we saw barbed wire inside the ground. At the test match in Christchurch, the TV coverage went from the side where the sunlight was behind the cameras across to the main grandstand and shot into the sun, which is against every camera principle. And there was barbed wire inside the ground. There were rows and rows of policemen, as I recall. And in the shots of the rugby action, you can see rows of policemen, and there's a very funny shot of a policeman turning his head and looking at to see if the try's been scored, and so on. Every game had protests in the town where the Springboks were playing, but more than that, there were protests at other towns too. If there was a game being played in Christchurch, for instance, there were protesters marching down the streets of Wellington, so the police were stretched in all directions, all over the country. It was a really trying time, and that was the rugby action and the police action. And in every household, there were divisions in households. One of the very prominent All Black players, his wife was totally against the tour and had nothing to do with his performance as a player, etc., etc. And so there was division on the tour. In households too, so it was something that New Zealand had really never struck before at that level.
Yeah. Let's take a moment to talk about the rugby. Were South Africa, the Springboks, at the top of their game?
Yes, they were, but they weren't, looking back with the advantage of hindsight, they weren't a great Springbok team. They had not been playing a lot of international rugby at that time. They were still, remember, South Africa were out of all sports. They were out of the Olympic Games, out of a lot of sports right through the 70s, and New Zealand was one of the rare countries that played with them. I went to the Olympics in Montreal, and the night before the opening ceremony, 29 countries, I think it was, boycotted the Olympic Games from Africa because New Zealand were touring South Africa at rugby at that time. So it was a worldwide protest about apartheid, and TV was just starting up in South Africa at the time. And so South Africa, I can remember when I got there in 1976, after being at the Olympic Games, the main TV show of the evening was Bonanza. I couldn't believe it, this old Western series. But slowly, South Africans via TV saw more and more how the world was treating or thought their apartheid system and the racial division that the laws of the country divided them with was abhorrent. And slowly it evolved. And so I think the arrival of TV and maybe the playing of sports helped to make the change, which happened after Mandela came out and the All Blacks went back, play one test against the Springboks the year he came out of jail after 27 years.
What was the security like for you as a broadcaster?
Interesting, very interesting. We didn't have any at the start. I travelled with the crew and co-commentator Graham Thorne, and we had nothing. But then after about 3 games, we noticed that there was a big guy close by us at all times, and he eventually we met him and we appreciated that he was looking after us, just the two of us. So if we went across the street to a restaurant, he would come in and take another table or a place in the restaurant. If we went to have a drink in the bar, he'd be there. He was a big guy. I've never seen him since, and he was out of he wasn't police. He was out of the SAS, and he kind of looked after us. But a couple of weeks after the tour, a guy came up to me in a pub. Sounds like all my stories come out of pubs,
Yeah.
Jesse. But a guy came up to me in the pub and he said, "How do you feel now the Springboks have gone?" And so here we go, another question about the Springboks tour.
Yeah.
I said, "Well, I suppose like a lot of people, I'm relieved." He said, "Well, you should be, because I was in a part of a group that was planning to kidnap you and Thorne before the third and final test, so that you didn't commentate and that your telecast would be disrupted." Well, of course, they would have found some other commentators, but that happened to Winston McCarthy with in the previous generation of radio broadcasting years and years earlier on a Springbok tour. It didn't quite happen, but it was mooted by some people. Yeah, so
that would have given you a bit of a fright, I imagine.
Well, it was certainly something to think about. There was the discussions and the division was such that another thing I've just thought about is I used to get into taxis. Now, I think I'm quite a genial bloke. I'd get in the front of the taxi and talk about the scrums and the lineouts and who won between Auckland and Wellington and Waikato and so on and so on. But on the Springbok tour, I would get in and sit behind the taxi driver, so that there was no chance of me speaking, giving my view on something, and he would come up with a complete opposite viewpoint, and then the tension is there for the ride home. So I sat behind the driver. So that was a tiny little thing that affected me. So tiny little things now become memories all these years later.
Yeah. What about the players? Because I know that, through the 70s, commentators and broadcasting teams used to travel really as part of the tour party. So I imagine you had pretty close relationships with the players. What was it like? What was their attitude towards you and the media? How was that kind of relationship?
Well, we were kind of discovered as whether we were pro-tour or anti-tour along the way. I remember a very prominent writer, still going, just had a book published about Billy Bush, was Phil Gifford.
Yes.
Now, Phil Gifford's view and my view were both anti-tour. And Phil remarked to me one day on the tour, he said, that a prominent member of the New Zealand Rugby Union made a speech at a rugby club in Pukekohe, there was somewhere close to that, not so long ago, and called us both enemies of rugby, because the word had got about that we would have preferred it if the Springboks hadn't have come to New Zealand. So we were tagged enemies of rugby. And a woman in Dunedin who was married to one of the Otago rugby officials. I knew her quite well. She came up to me and she said, "I'll never speak to you again." And I thought, oh, well, I don't know whether that's going to be significant in my life, but she never did. So a lot of things like that went on around the Springbok tour. The players were funny. Some of them were good and genial and just like they always were, either grouchy or good or whatever. Andy Hayden was a lovely guy, really. Andy Hayden became my manager when I did some commercial work after my sort of broadcasting career was over, and he became the great entrepreneur that he was in business. But one day when he was in there, and I got on really well with Andy over that, of course. But one day on the Springbok tour, when we all went out to McAllister Park in Wellington to watch the All Blacks practice, there they were running up and down on a muddy field at McAllister Park, and suddenly there was Andy Hayden throwing mud pies at the media. One of them hit me on the shoulder, and I looked up and thought, what's going on here? And there was Andy standing there saying, "Go on, clear off. You guys, clear off you," and worse.
Gosh.
And so those sort of things happened from some of the players. Some of them didn't mind at all. But that's what I recall now.
Okay, I'm looking through the results. Back in those days, of course, the touring team would play a lot of the regional sides. South Africa won all those games, as you might expect, although one is sticking out to me, and I don't remember hearing anyone talk about this, but it must have been a pretty significant game. 25th of August in Napier, Springboks versus New Zealand Māori. Do you remember that game?
Yes, I do. It was very interesting because it was a 12-all draw.
Yeah.
You're right. The Springboks beat all the provinces around New Zealand, but this was a 12-all draw. One of the Springboks, a guy called Colin Beck, got the ball quite a long way out. I was commentating on the game, and he let fly with a drop goal attempt. And the goalposts at McLean Park in Napier weren't very high, and so there's a bit of a discussion as the ball went high in the air whether it had gone over, but the referee ran forward and he signalled it's over, and some of the crowd said, "No, that didn't go over, that didn't go over," and the whistle went, and the game ended 12-all. So everybody was wondering whether that goal counted and affected the New Zealand Maori team scoring a win. But as the people left the ground, one guy came rushing up to me and said, "That didn't go over." I said, "Oh, how come? How do you know? You were sitting here in the halfway line. You wouldn't have seen the angle from behind the posts." He said, "No, as we were all leaving, Colin Meads was in front of me, and I said, hey, Pine Tree, do you think the kick went over?" And Pine Tree said, "No, that didn't go over." So if Pine Tree says it didn't go over, it didn't go over.
Yeah, it's gospel. Okay,
That's right, it's gospel.
Tell me about the tests, because they were a bit closer. Well, in fact, they went the other way. New Zealand won the first one, right?
Yeah, the first one was played in Christchurch and in front of all the police with their back to the game. Because if they'd turned their head and watched the game, some few guys might have been arrested for assault. There was a fiery game. There was a couple of big dust-ups because that sort of thing happened in rugby in those days. Fighting sort of happened. You've got to remember, too, the Springboks had to sleep away from hotels because of security. So they had slept the night in the Linwood Rugby Club, and the non-players, there was no room for the whole of the 30-man party. The non-players were billeted in people's rugby fans' homes. But the game was really feisty game, tough game, and a big crowd, and the TV coverage looking into the sunset at beautiful, lovely sunset at Christchurch. So some of the coverage has got these long, long shadows across the field. But that's the one the All Blacks won. But the Springboks are upset because they made a mistake there. Their captain, they had some internal ructions in their team, I think, because their captain was a guy called Wynand Claassen. And Wynand Claassen was deemed to be a sort of a more relaxed character. He came from Durban, and he wasn't such a steep, dyed-in-the-wool Afrikaner, and so they didn't play him in the first test. So they then deemed that to be a mistake, and they put him in the second test, and they made 8 changes from the team which lost the first test and might have lost the fight in the first test as well when they came to Wellington. And the Wellington game was more like an old-fashioned Springbok All Blacks test. There were 9 penalty goals kicked, Jesse, 5 by Nas Botha, who New Zealanders nicknamed Nasty Booter, and then Alan Hewson, who was the good guy, a local bloke. He got 4, and however, the only try in the game was scored by one of the Springboks. And here comes some pronunciation, mate. Gerry Germases. He scored the try, and they won quite well on the scoreboard by 24 to 12. The Springboks team had slept in the after-match function room at Athletic Park for the second test. And then when they went to Auckland for the third test, the protest was really getting fired up in Auckland because the Springboks were leaving the next day. And of course, most importantly, everybody knew that with 1 test each, you had to win the game to win the series. That was most important as well. And it was a really dramatic game because a protest plane started to fly over the ground.
I've got a little clip of that. Sorry, Keith, I've got a little clip of that. Let's take a few seconds of that.
Hockey Oosthuizen. There is a light plane circling the ground and dipping in low and dropping things into the crowd. And you can see the flower bombs are landing very close to the action there.
Gosh, that's your voice.
Yes,
How
it is.
Cool.
Well, it made about, some people are saying it made about 60 passes over Eden Park from the. Now I remember not the number
That's
of
chaos,
times.
That's chaos. The idea of a light plane flying like that.
No,
over
I remember that, and from my own personal point of view, it was so low that it was below the level of the top of the grandstand where I was commentating in a little room on top of the grandstand. So it was really dangerous. And at one stage, it was so low that people in the crowd threw cans of beer up in protest to try to hit it. Now, imagine if it hit it would have crashed into the crowd, perhaps. That would have been real chaos. And then the police made an announcement on the PA system, please don't throw cans or objects at the plane, because a full can of beer thrown in the air, Jesse, we all understand, has to come down. And there were 50,000 people at Eden Park. So there were a number of people who were injured by these beer cans coming down and hitting them and injuring them. So it was some of the protests, flower bombs hit the ground. One of them hit a player, Gary Knight. He was stunned, but in true All Black tradition, he got up and played on. And he was covered in white flour, and he played on. Really dramatic game.
Were you terrified?
Yes, I think it's fair to say. At the end of the game, I used to like to tap all my players neatly, all my pages of stuff neatly and put it into my briefcase. But when I got back to the hotel that night, I realized that I just jammed them in and was a sign of I just want to get off that top of that grandstand as fast as possible. I actually felt that the guy in the plane, I didn't know him, nobody knew him. Was he going to take out the coverage? Was he already the South African coverage had been cut through, the wires had been cut through up at Warkworth, so they were not getting any TV coverage. And so I thought, well, we got to get off here real quick, because who knows what might happen. Would they perhaps take out the commentary box? And that would take out the world coverage. That would therefore take me out as well. So I got off there as quick as I could. And in the end, the Springboks were, New Zealand led. They said that the Springboks played into the plane flight in the first half, so they fell behind the All Blacks. Doug Rollison, one of the players, said, we played quite well in the first half because the plane was behind us. We didn't see it coming. And so in the second half, the they played with the plane coming at them, and the Springboks levelled the score at 22-all, right into injury time. And the referee, Clive Norling from Wales, gave a penalty to New Zealand. Little Mark Donaldson, who I see quite regularly up at the beach, he tapped the ball and ran forward and was tackled before the Springboks went back 10 metres. I can see this in my mind's eye so vividly now. And so Alan Hewson stepped forward to kick the goal of his life to see if he could get it over to give New Zealand the win. He did just that, 25-22 to New Zealand, and New Zealand won the series. And everybody went home. Nobody went home really satisfied or happy. They were just pleased, and in my case, pleased it was all over. I flew home the next morning and flopped down and said, I never want to see this game again. It's been a hell 4 or 5 weeks. One of my mates rang up and said, hey, there's a good game at Athletic Park today in Wellington. Wellington's playing Manawatu. All those All Blacks are playing. Donaldson and Stu Wilson and Bernie Fraser and Jeff Old, they're all going to play. They must have come down on the train. So I went to the game. 35,000 people went to the rep game at Athletic Park, and it was a cracking game. And putting it in a funny way, we all fell in love with rugby all over again.
Keith Quinn, you've been a big part of our love affair with rugby. Thank you for your service to the game. Thanks so much for your time today. Really appreciate it. Thanks for listening to this episode of Sports History NZ, and special thanks to Keith Quinn for being my guest. Sports History NZ was produced by Melita Tull, Ayana Piper-Helian, Sally Ward and Sam Hollis. The podcast was put together by Justin Gregory. Tim Watkin is RNZ's executive producer of podcasts and series. And there are plenty more amazing stories just like this one from our sporting past for you to follow and listen to. You can find them at Apple Podcasts, iHeart, Spotify, or wherever you found this podcast.